Hello everyone and welcome to the RB Sides, a music review channel dedicated to reviewing remixes and remixers. In this video it's time for another RB remixer retrospective, and we got a doozy today as we look at every official rework done by the Scottish electronica band with a North American name, Boards of Canada. The Boards, as I will refer to them, are Michael Sanderson and Marcus Owen, a pair of childhood friends turned brothers who have developed a cult following for creating some of the most emotive and nostalgic electronic music since the mid-90s. Alongside their Warp Records contemporaries Aphex Twin and Autechre, they've been heavily associated with the contentiously named genre IDM, intelligent dance music, even though by their own admission they're not that interested in making people dance, and they don't even listen to a whole lot of electronic music, seeing their own music as closer to folk, pop and the television idents of the 1970s. Whatever their style though, it's resonated with a sizable audience and influenced artists in the world of R&B, rock and, yes, even dance music.
I listen to other people's music. I'll listen to like Boards of Canada.
Hell, their influence is so big they even get name-checked by desert bus speedrunners.
Boards of Canada are my absolute favorite band in the entire world. They're really good.
You go on YouTube, you'll find loads of Boards of Canada documentaries, think pieces, retrospective reviews, comedy sketches.
Hi, I'm Boards.
I'm Canada.
Even cover versions in the style of classic video game soundtracks. What you won't find, however, is any actual footage of them, which is why I've had to introduce them using a music video depicting them as plasticine puppets. And their voices have only been heard once in what could only charitably be described as an interview with the late Radio 1 DJ John Peel.
Right, well, what are you going to do now? Back to your secret lair to do more tunes?
We're off to the pub, actually.
Right, okay.
When they're not in the pub, they've spent years in the studio arduously creating 4 full-length albums, a handful of EPs, and to date a total of 13 official remixes for other artists. And in this video we are going to be ranking all of those reworks in the classic tier list format, ranking them based on how enjoyable I find them to listen to and how creatively I feel the duo approach the remixes. Please note that as always we are only going to be focusing on officially released remixes in this tier list, which means that I'm not going to be ranking the 2 Hell Interface reworks that they put together in the 90s. For what it's worth, those remixes of Colonel Abrams and Midnight Star are both interesting and worth checking out, but as they were not officially sanctioned by the artists in question, I feel it wouldn't be fair to try and place them in this list. Also, please note that Boards of Canada sometimes do more than one remix of a song, and in each case I'll be ranking the version that I consider to be definitive. Usually this just means that there's a vocal and an instrumental version, so I'll be going with the vocal version, but there's a couple of other curveballs along the way and I'll explain those when we get to them. As per usual, we are going to look at these remixes in alphabetical order of artists, starting with
One by one, we'll shoot our gun. We'll have fun.
Broken Drum by Beck, easily the biggest artist in this list. This track is from his 2005 album Guero, an album which followed Beck's most melancholic album to date, 2002's Sea Change, an album that dealt with the end of his 9-year relationship with stylist Lee Limon. Thus, after dropping such a downer on the public, Guero was understandably an attempt to get back into the more fun, upbeat Beck that we knew from the 90s, and for the most part as an album it does that. It's a typically quirky and self-assured selection of electronic rock tracks with goofy samples and beats that are perfect for doing the robot to.
Hell yes, not moving this way, I'm doing this thing.
Please enjoy.
Hell yes.
That said, Beck has left a little room for sadness in this album, and the resultant track of this is Broken Drum. It's a track that is dedicated to the influential rock artist Elliott Smith, who committed suicide in 2003. And although Beck's never been explicit about what Broken Drum is actually about, from the lyrical content it is widely believed to be about Smith as well.
Your setting sun, your broken drum, your little drugs, never forget you.
Stylistically, I like this track quite a lot. It's one of those songs that compositionally is kind of simple, but just has a lot of details that enrich it somewhat. It's built around a combination of a 808 drum, these trickling pianos, a subtle bass, and these occasional guitar chords that sound like erupting wails of grief. The track gently drifts along until the last minute, where it combines this itchy guitar shredding with Beck's ooh, with Beck's wordless croons over the top. I love the layering on this track, it's pretty gorgeous, and I feel like the emotional content of it is pretty direct without being cloying. Guero came out at a time when Boards of Canada were largely refusing remix work, to the point where they told Warp Records to only accept calls if they were from Beck or God. And a few months later, Beck got in contact, although for some reason he was dressed as God during the call. They accepted the request for the remix under the proviso that the track that they worked on would be something that was quite slow and empty, and Broken Drum fortunately very much fits the bill. So this rework appears on Guero's 2005 remix companion Guerolito, which is an album that's on my extremely long list of ones that I want to review for this channel. It kind of shifts the focus from the sadness of the original into a slightly less well-trodden theme when it comes to grief, and that's numbness. It's built around this guitar loop that sounds like a muffled pigeon chirping away in the background. The guitar here has been reversed by Boards themselves, just in case you thought I'd pressed the wrong button. I don't mind backwards elements in music when they've been integrated thoughtfully, like in Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles, or like Spinning Plates by Radiohead. But I think sometimes musical elements can be reversed kind of instinctively in order to just make something sound more psychedelic, to the point where they end up sounding more aimless, like the guitar solo in Red Hot Chili Peppers' Give It Away, for example. And for me, I think Boards go a little too heavy on the backwards stuff in this track at points. There's a moment in the middle of the track where they add a bunch of other reversed elements as well. I did try playing the track backwards to find out what they reversed. And honestly, I think some of these elements would have been more successful if they'd been played forwards. That said though, it does give some of the more sharp focused elements in this track more of a breakthrough quality, such as the solo synth piano that comes in around the 2-minute mark.
When I say very well, only
The beat on Boards' remix has a little bit more of a spring in its step, with a kind of trip-hop style to it, especially with this occasional drum fill that sounds like the track tripping up over itself. There's also these choral synths that come in towards the end to accompany the oohs, and for me this is the absolute highlight of the track. This ending part is fantastic and even more effective than the outro of the original. So yeah, I like this remix a lot. It's not quite S tier for me, just because, as I say, I feel like they go a little too hard on the backwards effect here and there, but the overall effect is so strong that this goes right at the top of the A tier for me. This is a great remix. Boom Bip, Last Walk Around Mirror Lake. This is the final track from his 2002 album Seed to Sun. Boom Bip described his sound as a bit like Marianne Faithfull on Prozac, with vitamins and a computer, a penis and a few guitars. Just going to leave this list on screen for a little bit in case you want to write down how to make yourself sound like Boom Bip. Discography-wise, he's probably most well known at this point for Circle, the spectacular abstract hip-hop suite he created with Anticon's nasal tour de force Dose 1, and an album that John Peel famously compared to avant-rock maverick and tyrant Captain Beefheart. Seed to Sun, however, was the culmination of an 8-month period in which Boom Bip set to build his studio with real instruments and work his way towards making less sample-based music. His ambitions for this project were pretty modest given that he didn't really have much of a game plan other than to make some music, but as I mentioned when I discussed him in my review of Eamon Tobin at the start of this channel, he does seem to be heavily influenced by post-rock artists like Mogwai, and Last Walk Around Mirror Lake seems to have taken the minimalism of post-rock to heart, given that it is made of very few elements. For the first 3 minutes of the song, it's just a strummed guitar that is all treble, no bass, so unlikely to be enjoyed by Meghan Trainor anytime soon. There's at least one extra element over the top of this, which sounds like a guitar that's been EQ'd to sound more like a harmonica, but apart from that, it's pretty much the same thing for the first 3 minutes, and to be honest, I find the amount of time it spends at this EQ level kind of painful. There's then a brief break around the 3-minute mark, and then the guitar comes back in, but with the full dynamic range this time. But generally it just keeps on plugging away with the same chords until the 5-minute mark. As far as album endings go, I think I would call this track nondescript. Although I will say I'm relieved that the track is not 12 minutes long as the track time initially suggested. This album was basically from the time when artists used to have a long bit of silence after their last track, and then they'd smuggle in a little hidden track at the end. Kind of feel like you should do this sort of sound check at the beginning of the album rather than the end, but what do I know. The Boards of Canada remix originally appeared on the EP From Left to Right, which is one of 2 EPs that were released after Seed to Sun that contained bonus tracks and remixes. Both of these EPs were combined together to make the compilation album Corim, which is most likely where you'll find these remixes on streaming services these days. Although I am going to be putting the EP artwork for this review because honestly I've always loved this artwork. It's like Lex Records had complaints about the barcode being difficult to find. Anyway, Boards do seem to use a little bit of the guitar from the original version, given that there's not much else they can use for this remix. But they whittle it down to isolated chords and they combine it with this wonderful candy floss synth that creates this real dreamland effect throughout. It's proper heavenly stuff, and melodically I've got to say this track is very much on point. That said, there is one production choice on this track that thoroughly compromises my enjoyment of it, and unfortunately that is the drums. Boards of Canada have talked in a lot of interviews about how melody is their prime focus in their music, and although they certainly don't ignore the drums when it comes to production, there is a clear hierarchy in elements when it comes to a lot of their output. One of my main problems with their second album, GeoGaddy, is that some of the tracks have these beats that are kind of abrasive and call a little too much attention to themselves through their abstractness. And don't get me wrong, I'm very much a fan of abstract beats when done right, but the problem with Boards is that they tend to keep the drums pretty constant throughout a track without altering them too much, so if they pick a beat that doesn't work with me, then I'm stuck with it for the entire track. And that's the case here. They've just got this big slurping slug of a beat that feels like it's been placed a little too high up in the mix compared to the melodic elements. There's a couple of little reprieves here and there in the track, but for the most part it's really prominent and it utterly saps the strength of this track for me. I really love the melodic elements in this track. The synths and the guitar are great, and with a different beat this could easily have been in the upper tiers for me. As it stands, however, I find this beat so distracting that unfortunately I can't bring myself to put this any higher than the C tier. It's not so bad that it's unlistenable to me, but as far as Boards of Canada beats go, this one feels like a rare misfire. Bubbah's Tum, Dirty Great. I think it's safe to say that this is the most obscure artist that Boards of Canada ended up remixing across their career. Bubbah's Tum is a one-off alias created by James Goldblatt, who seems to have relatively few musical credits to his name, other than several collaborations as part of Beck's Cabbage Boy project. Dirty Great Mabel is the only track to ever have been released under the Bubbah's Tum alias, and it appeared on the obscure 1997 compilation Spunk Jazz, part of a long tradition of subgenres named after bodily excretions alongside shitwave and P-Funk. I listened to the few tracks from this album that I could find online, and they are about as masturbatory as you'd expect. Mainly a bunch of late 90s Ninja Tune adjacent drum and bass experiments, chopping up largely jazz-based percussion into drill and bass and breakcore compositions. Dirty Great Mabel is a little bit of a standout on this album though, given that it is much more built around early 90s G-Funk, particularly in the first minute, which is built around a smacking hip-hop beat and the typically high-pitched G-Funk mini-moog sound. This happens for a few bars until it stops entirely to allow for a vocal sample.
And man, I got a double super buzz. Here I was huffing airplane glue in a sandwich bag.
The vocal sample you hear here isn't actually a Mike Judge character, but it is instead from Jesco White, a folk dancer and entertainer who's been the subject of numerous documentaries over the years.
And then I'd take me a hit of that gas. Right after I'd hit. Man, you talking about a warped mind, I got one.
He does. I've seen his YouTube channel. After this rather abrupt diversion, Goldblatt basically rides out the drums for the rest of the track. At some points he plasters them with reverb so that they sound like they're coming from the end of an alleyway. At other times he cranks the drums up so loud they get kind of distorted in the mix. There's a few loose vocal samples here and there, and he starts improvising with the mini-moog as the track goes along, but that's pretty much it. Feels like a sort of wacky Luke Viber-esque beat experiment. It's a little too basic for my ears and doesn't really have much in the way of structure, but I could see it working well in the hands of a decent abstract hip-hop DJ. As such, given its unfinished sounding nature, this track is a veritable playground for remixes, which may explain why it got its own release in 1998 with a whole heap of remixes in tow, including one from Boards of Canada. Their main addition to this track, quite predictably, is some melody, but surprisingly they keep quite a bit of the original track's elements in here as well. For one, they use the G-Funk beat from the original as the drums for this track, and it fits their aesthetic shockingly well. Another thing I like about this remix is how Boards of Canada transpose the various vocal samples from the original into their new composition, including, and I didn't notice this for the longest time, but they've actually made some rhythmic elements out of the Jesco White sample. Which, given how that sample was just plonked in the middle of the original track, is kind of genius. Then in the final section of the track they switch melodies to something less wistful and more chaotic. And they double up the G-Funk beat around this point as well, and it's a really effective end to this track. But yeah, I like this remix a lot. It's a classic example of an artist taking an original that's somewhat messy and unfinished and just fleshing it out into something more complete. For me, this one is an A tier remix as well. I wouldn't put it on the level of S tier just because it doesn't quite have that killer moment in it for me that makes it transcendental, but I'll put it just below Beck here. It's another really solid remix, this one.
It's hard to stand the sight of two dogs dead under a sky so blue. You have to stop the blood to your head.
CLOUDDEAD, Dead Dogs 2 from their second and last album, 10. CLOUDDEAD are the legendary trio of Anticon artists Yoni Wolf, aka Y, Adam Drucker, aka the aforementioned Dose 1, and Dave Madsen, aka Odd Nosdam. A trio whose work under this mantle made one hell of an impact on the abstract hip-hop world at the time, only for the three of them to then call it a day with this particular project shortly after. I remember hearing Dead Dogs 2 for the first time back at university and being absolutely blown away by it.
From the height of the highway on ramp we saw two dogs dead in a field, glowing on the Oakland Coliseum green seats wasteland.
I'd already been slightly inoculated to the Anticon sound as a result of the Jaime's Basement album that Yoni Wolf did, but still wasn't prepared for this. Dead Dogs 2 is a clear standout from the 10 album, and of all the tracks on it is the one that most resembles a pop song, even though there's a track that's actually called Pop Song. It's got a clear delineation between verses and choruses, but as far as its subject matter and lyrical content goes, it's so peculiar that maybe it was just too obscure to ever be considered pop.
We secretly long to be some part of a car crash. Long to see your arms stripped to the tendons.
And let's be honest, Y and Dose 1's vocals are never going to be for everyone, even in the age of SpongeBob SquarePants. The lyrics do sound kind of surreal, but Yoni mentioned in an interview with Wire magazine years ago that a lot of their lyrics are so zoomed in on the stuff that they're talking about that you don't necessarily see the context behind it. Anyway, yeah, if you can't tell already, I love this song. I love the drones during the verses, I love the melodies during the chorus.
It's hard to stand the sight of two dogs dead under a sky so blue. You have to stop the blood to your head.
I love the way the verses are just traded between Y and Dose 1 constantly, Run DMC style. I love the vocals, I love the Werner Herzog sample at the end with the birds chirping in the background.
There is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
And it seems like others did too. There's footage of a 2008 reunion concert they did in which the audience are singing along with the lyrics. Also, Jack White of all people ended up doing a cover of the song when he performed in San Francisco in 2014. Anyway, yeah, great song, and I also remember hearing the Boards of Canada remix at the time. Dose 1 has a cool story about how this remix came about, in that he was at one of Warp Records' legendary Lighthouse parties. He was walking around handing out CLOUDDEAD 10 inches with some stuffed animals that he'd made as merchandise, and people like Ortecker and Bjork were looking at him daggers. But then he bumped into the Boards of Canada boys at the back of the tour bus and they bonded immediately. And they loved his stuffed animals. They ended up doing this remix for the Dead Dogs 2 single. And this remix has always stood out to me because it's one of the most labour-intensive remixes I've ever heard. It starts off fairly unassuming with a slightly weightier beat than the original and this airy synth ambience in the background.
From the height of the highway on ramp we saw two dogs dead in a field.
But then as it goes along, it just builds and builds. Boards basically seem to challenge themselves in this remix to add more and more psychedelic touches to the track over the course of its 5 minutes. You get a whole bunch of synth noodling, some sitar, some piano,
Center of a curious crowd.
you got these flutes in the chorus.
It's hard to stand the sight of two dogs dead under a sky so blue.
These flutes seem to have been sampled from the Incredible String Band's 1966 track When the Music Starts to Play. It's a track that seems to provide a rich well of flutes for the duo, given that at least 3 tracks on the Gaddy album have been credited as sampling this track. A lot of critics have noticed the similarities between this and the more psychedelic era of the Beatles, and Marcus Owen did mention in an interview that it was the chord progression of the track that reminded him of the Beatles and inspired the overall direction. He does also point out in the same paragraph that it was meant as more of a tribute to ELO than the Beatles, but some of the aspects towards the end feel very Beatles-esque. In particular the strings that have something of the Eleanor Rigby about them. And that's before we talk about the massive piano chord that it all leads up to, which is heavily based on A Day in the Life. But wherever the hell they got the inspiration from for this remix, this is an absolute masterpiece. For me, they took an already great track and they left no stone unturned when it came to bettering it. Yeah, I loved this remix as an adolescent and I still love it now. For me, this is an absolute benchmark of remixing and this easily goes in the S tier. Meet Beat Manifesto, Prime Audio Soup from the 1998 album Actual Sounds and Voices. I've covered Jack Danger's MBM outfit a few times on this channel before, and he's one of those names who just seems to keep coming up in dance music. Prime Audio Soup seems to go back a little bit to the industrial tinged dance anarchy of his 1990 album Storm the Studio, albeit with a few more jazz-based influences thrown into the fray. This is a track that I don't recall hearing before I started researching this review, although I think many people will have heard it at least once, given that it was in the soundtrack to The Matrix, in what I understand is quite a prominent scene involving a telephone.
We're in.
I am one of only 3 people left in the world who hasn't seen The Matrix, so this was news to me, but it did remind me of another track that I have heard, which is heavily associated with The Matrix, and that is Spy Break by the Propellerheads. In fact, it reminds me of a couple of Propellerheads songs. There's an acid line in there that also reminds me of Bang On. Personally though, I like this Meet Beat Manifesto track a lot better. Those big dustbin drums and the synth arpeggiator very much fit into film soundtrack territory, but you've also got aspects like the vocal sample, which comes from the 1974 dub reggae song Congo Call by Dub Specialist.
Just take these chains away and set me free.
More loose and funky with an industrial twist, maybe a little bit Big Beat overall, but given that Big Beat wouldn't exist without Meet Beat Manifesto, then I think it's only fair that he tried to get in on the action in the late 90s. Of all the tracks in this list that Boards of Canada ended up remixing, I'd say the original here is probably the most outside of their wheelhouse, and consequently this ends up being one of their darkest remixes, and to some extent one of their most empty ones as well. It's built around a much more gentle and typical Boards of Canada style breakbeat than the original. Moments like the dub specialist vocal or the choral sample from the original do pop up, but then they immediately seem to disappear again. Boards also add a few of their own vocal samples into the mix, including some from, of all places, Sesame Street.
6, 7, 8. 7, 8.
Which is nothing new in the Boards of Canada universe. Their first album, Music Has the Right to Children, had lots of samples of children speaking in it, to the point where they actively moved away from that trope due to the formulaic imitators it was inspiring. The weirdest sample in this, though, is a light drone that is taken from the Jesus Christ Superstar soundtrack. Again, not a new Boards of Canada thing, they used it in their track Happy Cycling, but bloody hell man, whoever found that was the sample deserves at least a pint. Overall, this is pretty sparse, and there's lots of individual nice melodic ideas in this track. But nothing that really seems to dominate, apart from maybe this light synth that comes in towards the end. It's a subtle remix, this one, basically, and I do like it quite a bit. I'd say this one goes in the B tier, but it's very high in the B tier for me. It's almost an A, but just doesn't quite have that killer moment for me. Michael Fakesch, Surface, from his 1998 album Marion. Although it first appeared on his 1997 EP Demon 1, which is also where the Boards remix was first released. Fakesch is a sound designer whose recent portfolio mainly seems to be working on adverts, particularly in the realm of cars, shoes and Lego remakes of big budget epics. In the music world, he's probably most well known for being half of the glitch hop / IDM duo Funkstrong, an artist who I've been aware of for years but never really properly delved into their discography, mainly due to the fact that I was put off by their heavily twitchy remix of one of my favourite Bjork tracks. Full of glitching beats and weird EQ decisions, and personally I think if you want a decent IDM version of this song, then Played do a much better remix. And in fact Played are a decent name to mention in relation to this Fakesch track Surface, given that they're the artist it largely reminds me of. This track is built around these glassy synth pads that oscillate around, whilst some very digital sounding break beats underpin it. I quite like the melodic cacophony that he creates here, but there's this snare sound that comes in around 1.5 minutes in that kind of just sounds like a dragon coughing throughout. And it stays at that same level for most of the rest of the track, so pleasant melodies but overpowering beats, and just not really keen on it overall as a composition. If I'm not going to let Boards get away with it on that Boom Bip remix, I'm certainly not letting Fakesch get away with this. Historically, there are actually two different versions of Boards of Canada's remix of Surface, given that the original version released in 1998 is 30 seconds shorter than the version that appears on the 20th anniversary release of Marion in 2018. Don't know why I got all these years so wrong when recording this Fakesch bit, Jesus Christ. Just read the text on screen for the years on this bit, please. Listening to the two tracks side by side, it seems that the only difference is that the re-release version is 10% slower. This might indicate that the original was released at the wrong speed, John Peel style, or maybe this is more of a retcon. You can make a case for either version being the definitive remix. The 1998 version is at the same speed, more or less, as the Fakesch track, so it could well have been something that Boards of Canada put together before they realised they weren't really a techno-tempo act. On the other hand, the 2018 version does fit a lot more cohesively with Boards of Canada's discography, and I kind of feel like it wouldn't have been changed speed if it wasn't meant to be like that in the first place. Both versions are out there if you want to make your own mind up about it, but personally I'm going to go with the 2018 re-release of this as the definitive version that I'm going to rank here. In either case, there's nothing in this Boards of Canada remix that seems like it's been directly taken from the Fakesch track. It's got a lot of classic Boards of Canada elements to it. You've got these warm music has the right to children-esque chords that open the piece. Under these synths, they gradually build up a beat in a particularly unhurried fashion. And there's a backmasked vocal sample quite low in the mix, which is from John Decker from the Christian Science Monitor. After a while, the dreamy synths then start getting replaced with a much gloomier, overcast synth. What I'm less keen on is the major key arpeggiator that then fades up out of these clouds. It's an interesting idea for an ending, but it feels a little bit on the nose for me, and the shift between major and minor keys in this remix just ends up feeling a little bit slapdash to me. It's pretty pleasant overall, not really a Boards of Canada remix that I would reach for voluntarily, but definitely wouldn't mind if this came on in a public place. So yeah, on that basis, for me it goes kind of low in the B tier. Mira Calix Sand Sings from her 1998 debut EP, Pin Skeeling. Calix is an artist whose name has always jumped out at me due to it having an X in it, but I sadly never got around to checking out her output until now, and given that she took her life in 2022, I kind of feel a little bad about that. Calix was a multidisciplinary artist working in the worlds of film and installations, mainly in the field of sound art, and as such the few tracks that I've listened to from her thus far definitely have more of a soundscapey approach to them. A lot of deliberately awkward juxtapositions of melodic and rhythmic ideas. Sand Sings seems like an early experiment in this journey, and it's probably the darkest original track that features in this list, given that it mainly comprises of static and a descending tone being repeated over and over. There's these very distant, echoey vocals from Calix that seem to be saying the track title over and over. Doesn't really develop much over the course of its 5 minutes, it just gets fuller and fuller. But I like these dystopian shortwave radio vibes quite a bit. It seems like a middle point between the darker experiments of Delia Derbyshire and the noise-based aesthetic of artists like Pharmacon in the 21st century. The Pin Skeeling EP included 2 remixes of Sand Sings, one by Boards of Canada and one by an artist called Vendor Refill that's called the Stylophone Mix. Interestingly, both of these remixes are much lighter in tone than the original, and they both appear before it in the track list as well, making it one of those tracks where the remixes have been deemed to be more accessible than the original. The main element that boards seem to have taken for their remix is the vocal from the original, which, like many of the vocal samples they work with, fits very well in their sound world. It's built around a light synth line that has something of an autumnal quality to it. It gets fuller as the track goes along, and the beats have that typically rigid clappy quality to them. There's a very brief snippet of buzzing in the breakdown later on in the track, which might be taken from the original. It's probably the one from all of the 90s remixes that sounds the most like a Right to Children offcut, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I really like that album. I'm going to put this one fairly low in the A tier. It doesn't have any major twists in it like some of the other remixes we discussed so far, but the vibe in it is really lush, and yeah, another great remix.
Between give and
Nevermen, a band who Boards of Canada have remixed 2 songs for, and we're going to start with Mr. Mistake from 2016. They're a trio comprising Dose One, Mike Patton and Tunde Adebimpe from TV on the Radio, all artists whose work I have massively enjoyed in various capacities. It originally stemmed from Mike Patton's idea for having a band that was comprised of 3 frontmen without any specific hierarchy in who the main focus was, and the lyrics were all written by Dose One for this album, but they were written with the perspectives of all 3 of them in mind, and there's no point in the album where any of the artists get an entire verse to themselves. There's a constant rotation in terms of which vocalist is singing at which point. In terms of musical influence, I feel I very much hear Mike Patton's fingerprints all over Mr. Mistake. It goes from this funk rock to this stomping industrial beat, and then the vocals kind of come in a seemingly almost barbershop style.
So make no mistake, Mr. Take your paperwork safe for your fast.
I like the sturdiness to the beat, but the vibe overall in the production is a little indeterminate. It does seem like it's very much secondary to the vocals. Production-wise, my favourite elements come towards the end of the track when there's a breakdown with some big mournful chords and soaring synths. But it kind of doesn't really last long enough until the beat just hammers back in, and that's kind of an allegory for the problems that I have with this project, in that it just seems to be relentlessly hitting you with ideas non-stop, and just when you're getting used to it, the track ends. The Boards of Canada remix got a full release in 2017, both as a download and as a 7-inch picture disc. The vibe is much more mellow from the off, with this wistful synth that reminds me a fair bit of Matthew Robert Cooper's Illuvium project.
So make no mistake, Mr. Take your paperwork safe for your fast.
The vocals then come in over the top of this with a fair bit of reverb on them and a more distant quality that reminds me of all things Ladysmith Black Mambazo.
It's between give and
The harmonies in this context just have more of a sunrise choral chant vibe to them, and I'm very much here for it. But ultimately this section is just the warm-up, as once the vocals have gone through the entire song, the beat comes in with these huge sounding shimmering synths over the top. And my word, is this a great payoff. I already like the first section, but this caps it off absolutely perfectly. Similarly to the cLOUDDEAD remix, more and more elements are coming in. You've got bigger synths, these arpeggiators going up and down. There's even a whoosh at one point that sounds like the red arrows flying past. But yeah, it's a real shot of euphoria of this one. I was really taken aback by this remix. It basically adds the kind of payoff I was hoping for from the original. It has all the tension of the vocals and then it just completely goes ham with the gorgeous production elements. This is another S-tier remix for me, and I did think long and hard about whether I think this is better than the cLOUDDEAD one or not. And I think my head prefers the cLOUDDEAD version. I think it's more technically impressive in terms of the elements that it adds and what it achieves overall. But my heart prefers this remix just because it's a much more direct emotional shot. And yeah, I think I'm going to go with Roxette's advice and I'm going to pop this one just above cLOUDDEAD for me. Although they're very close. There's really not a lot in between the two, but yeah, this Nevermen remix is absolutely sensational for me.
Under its weight. It's true.
Then we have Treat 'Em Right, also from Nevermen's self-titled album. Whereas I did quite like some elements of Mr. Mistake, with this track I'm much more lukewarm on the original. One thing I like about both tracks is the way that they switch between the vocals. I do like that interplay a lot, but again, it just feels really relentless in this context, and the production does it no favours whatsoever. It all just feels a bit muddy in this instance. You've got these big drums, the gas of some half-formed melodies floating around, and yeah, it's just very full-on, but also weirdly flavourless. I also don't really get what either track is about lyrically that much. Mr. Mistake seems to be about death, as far as I can tell, whereas this one repeats the refrain, treat him like a prostitute. So I'm guessing this is something about big capitalist power struggles or something, as opposed to, you know, sex work. Boards of Canada's remix of Treat 'Em Right was released in 2021, making it the most recent Boards of Canada remix to have been released. From what I can tell, they worked on remixes of a few different Nevermen tracks at the time, and they had this one left over, which they kindly donated to Lex Records for their 20th anniversary remix series. The fact that this wasn't the remix they chose to release at the time does kind of imply that it wasn't as good as the Mr. Mistake remix, and to be honest, yeah, that is kind of right. But that said, I do like quite a few elements of this track. For one thing, it's probably the most unique sounding Boards of Canada remix, given that it's got this weird mix of dub techno, R&B and even calypso in it.
Invent the alphabet to keep yourself busy. Sick pollen on barbed wire and man hands on fire. You've been made.
I like the ambience of this combined with the swagger of the beat, but I don't think it entirely coheres with the vocals, at least for the first half of the track. Part of this might be due to the fact that the vocals are slightly buried in the mix. It might also just be that the rapid fire, constantly switching delivery of the vocals doesn't quite suit the backing track here, and you can hear that they've retimed the vocals a little bit during the choruses in order to fit their structure. That said, I do like the way they've tried to pace the vocals a bit more leisurely, and one cool detail is how they take a couple of loose phrases from the first verse and create a kind of makeshift chorus towards the end of the track. There's some lovely musical elements in the track as well, like this glassy organ sound that and there's this glittering arpeggio that comes in as well that's actually reused from their Right to Children track Open the Light. For me, this is a really cool detail as it has a very different effect on this particular remix. It felt like more of the backbone to open the light, whereas here it feels like more of a garnish. I think this remix is pretty cool. I could see myself possibly warming to the instrumental more over time, but as I've consigned myself to reviewing the vocal versions of these Boards of Canada remixes, I'm going to put this one in the B tier, purely because I don't think it quite works entirely with the vocals. Though that said, I like its quirky uniqueness in Boards of Canada's discography, and it embraces some of their R&B side, which doesn't really come up in that many of their tracks. So yeah, I'm going to say this goes higher in the B tier, just below Beat Manifesto. Sisters, the title track from the 2016 album by Nosdam, the producer from cLOUDDEAD. This is a largely instrumental album that's built around psychedelic hip-hop instrumentals, often with a spiritual slant to them. And this title track is about as spiritual and aesthetic as you can get, given that it seems to comprise samples of singing nuns. These are laid over the top of this organ sample, which, as much as it sounds churchy, it also has something of a 70s prog feel to it. There's very little percussion in this track, there's just these two kick drums and a cymbal that propel it along. It doesn't develop a huge amount over the track, it does a few different cycles of the vocal and then it ends on a looped bit. But yeah, there's something kind of special about this track, it's hard to put your finger on. I wasn't hugely keen on it when I first heard it, but now kind of love it. The Boards of Canada remix was commissioned in order to try and give this album some more clout, although it seems like the duo took a while to get around to it, to the point where the album, which was ready to release in 2014, didn't actually get released until 2 years later. There are other factors that affected it as well, but it does seem like the polite pestering of the duo seemed to be what kept things back a little bit. In terms of what their remix actually does to the track, they add a beat. That's pretty much it. It's not just any beat, to be fair, it has this electronic burble to it that reminded me quite a lot of the sort of beats that Panda Bear was using on his Meets the Grim Reaper album, particularly on the track Boys Latin. Part of my problem with this beat is it's quite stop-start. It has this gap in it every 2 bars that just sucks the momentum each time. And I don't think this would be a problem if this remix developed over its runtime, but it doesn't. It's pretty much just this beat over and over again with the sample until it fades out. I'm kind of inclined to believe that Boards just didn't have any great ideas as to how to do this remix, and given how long it took them to get around to doing it, they just threw this beat on there and gave it back to them. It gives me slight vibes of Daft Punk's remix of Franz Ferdinand, although I should stress I don't feel anywhere near as unkind towards this remix as I did to that. Nothing that Boards of Canada add here outright ruins the song, but the way the beat drops out at the end of every second bar for the entire track just feels annoyingly non-committal. It's like Boards couldn't decide if they wanted to preserve the gorgeous stasis of the original or develop it into something more layered and beat-driven, and so they settled on this perennially stifled rhythm that doesn't really achieve either. It's not a disaster, it is listenable, but I also find this one just kind of frustrating, and overall I consider this to be one of their weakest remixes. So I'm putting this low in the C tier.
Sometimes I
Sometimes by the Sexual Objects, a Scottish band comprising members of various long-running rock bands, going as far back as at least the 80s. There's way too much history of each member to go into here, but the important thing to know is they are friends of the Boards of Canada boys. They even recorded their first single as a band at the duo's own Hexagon Sun Studios, which the two of them also helped produce.
Just wanna spread my wings, don't wanna fly away. Just wanna spread my wings.
You do hear a little bit of their warmth in the production, but ultimately they're working in service of the Sexual Objects vision. Sometimes is a track from their 2017 album Marshmallow, which was released in a particularly unique manner. Owing to the way in which streaming has devalued music in the last couple of decades, they decided to release this album directly to eBay in the form of one single copy. Whoever won the bid for the album got full ownership to reproduce the album further if they wanted to, or not if they didn't. And thanks to Wayback Machine, I can tell you that the album sold for over £4,000, and the winning bid was from Scottish record label Triassic Tusk, who ended up pressing and releasing a further 300 copies of the album. In terms of the actual music, sometimes has some 70s rock vibes, or maybe a little bit of Beatles or Rolling Stones.
I get my kicks, making licks from your town.
The piano and the guitar have this end of a film soundtrack quality to them, and the chorus is simultaneously both bratty and gorgeous, which is a fantastic combination.
Sometimes I wish I had, baby. Sometimes.
Don't know if they're trailing off mid-sentence or they genuinely want a baby. Maybe it's a response track to that Ace of Base song. At any rate, yeah, I quite like this. I wouldn't go out my way to own the album to get it, but definitely wouldn't mind hearing this in a pub. Given that they already work with a band, a Boards of Canada remix seemed only natural, and it appeared on this limited 10-inch remix package. Starts off with some typical crepuscular Boards of Canada synths, and then after a while the piano comes in. This beatless intro builds and builds. You've got this lovely shoegazy drone in the background and this wonderful music box style keyboard. And then after just the right amount of time, the beat comes in and we get the main chorus from the original, and it's once again a perfect payoff. Made me think somewhere between Abbey Road era Beatles and early Spiritualized. Yeah, another really beautiful remix, this one. There is a small part of me that wished they'd used more of the verse vocals from the original, but honestly I don't really know how they would have fit those in. Putting this one in the S tier as well, just below cLOUDDEAD for me. Very strong composition, this one. Really like it. Slag Boom Van Loon Poppy Seed. This is a collaboration between two different electronic artists, IDM legend Mike Paradinas, aka Music, and the Dutch hardcore DJ Speedy J. I did try and find out what the name means briefly, I didn't get very far. Apparently it was based on a sticker they found in Speedy J's studio. Slag Boom is Dutch for car park gate as far as I can tell, but that's all I got. This track, Poppy Seed, comes from their self-titled album, and it does seem to be a pretty successful matchup of Paradinus' melodic impulses and Jay's more rhythmic obsessions. It starts off with a groove that sounds like it's been made with a combination of a lawnmower and someone mucking around with the touchpad on a phone. It then develops into this acid techno track with a modest kick drum and a keyboard that sounds like a mobile phone notification. very phony is what I'm saying, but in a good way. I like the whimsical quality of this track. It's kind of minimal on one level, but also densely layered on another, which is a great combination. It's very dreamy, and out of all of the tracks that Boards of Canada ended up remixing in their career, it's probably the one that sonically has the most in common with the duo, at least melodically if not rhythmically. Their rework appears on the Slag Boom Van Loon remix album So Soon, released a few years after the original album, and consequently for me it's the first Boards remix that sounds like it's a step on from the Right to Children era. As always, it's pretty down-tempo, the chords sound like they've kind of been taken from the original and slowed down, and there's a light popping to the synths that gives it an extra rhythmic quality. For me, this track is much more at the new agey end of their sound spectrum, which I don't think they really see as a compliment, but it's hard to really think anything else given how much flute they put in this. I don't think these ones are sampled from Incredible String Band, but I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. But yeah, it's basically just this fun flute noodling over the main chords of the track, and a couple of points you can hear them directly reference the melody from the original. It's like they're taking that refrain but just jamming with it, which is a really nice touch. You get another classic Boards of Canada vocal sample around the 4.5 minute mark. It's more references to religious cults from the US, this time from a TV show called Mysteries, Magic and Miracles. Welp, they did say they wanted to remix God. Yeah, this is a great remix. I think it runs out of ideas a little after that vocal sample, but the dreaminess of it is pretty lush. There's also an additional remix that they contributed to the So Soon album, which is titled the Boards of Canada Reprise. This is a short little doodle that basically converts some of the elements of the track into a short, almost ident-like track. Feels a lot like those TV jingles that they discuss in interviews that inspired a lot of their work. It's decent, but I prefer the original, so that's the version I'm going to be ranking. And yeah, another solid remix, this one. This one goes in the A tier for me. I'm putting it near the bottom just because it's a little too fluffy for me overall, but I find the ambience very pleasing nonetheless.
Tickets at the free bar at my cousin's bat mitzvah. Cutting the punchline and it ain't no joke. Devoid of all hope, circus mirrors and pot smoke.
Finally, Good Friday by Y. This is Yoni Wolf again, although by this point in his career he had transferred the Y alias over from just being his moniker to being the name of his entire band. And the album that this track is from, Alopecia, was an attempt to shift his songwriting and musical style to be more collaborative and more ready for live performance. I hadn't heard this album prior to this review, although I do own his earlier album, Oakland Azul Asylum, which is a slightly hodgepodge but nonetheless fun set of folk rap gems, and based on what I hear here, it seems like with Alopecia they've gone for a more fuller sound.
Or Good Friday.
What's Good Friday also called?
I'm sorry. Okay, Good Friday is called Shit.
This song doesn't hang around with getting straight into it. It starts with this pavement-esque drum strut and guitar, and the lyrics come at us within the first 2 seconds.
If you grew up with white boys who only look at black and Puerto Rican porno, cause they want something that their dad don't got.
The vocals are Yoni basically admonishing himself for some of his more indulgent and destructive behaviour. Lots of references to substance abuse and some less edifying sexual behaviour.
Intently staring at the picture of your feet on the sticker. At the R. Crumb exhibit, I wonder who's sicker. Jerking off in an art museum John till my dick hurts. The kind of shit I won't admit to my head shrinker.
Although Yoni doesn't seem like he's glamorizing this behaviour at all. He goes through it in this patient, measured murmur that almost sounds like he's being his own judge at his own trial. The musical backing suits this perfectly though. You've got this guitar line that goes up, and then up, and then up, and then down, and then down, and then down, and then up, simultaneously suggesting shifts in mood with this strange sense of numbness throughout, like he's just bumbling through life being a self-indulgent idiot. You then get these drones throughout that are positioned more or less perfectly. They come in like moments of epiphany.
Feels exciting.
And the choruses have this awkward mirrored structure to them that almost sounds like he's chanting a mantra to get him out of this situation.
If I'm sinking and laughing at something sunken in, I am. If I'm sinking and laughing at something sunken in, I am. If I'm sinking and laughing at something sunken in, I am.
It is an absolutely gorgeous production that somehow toes the line between being self-pitying and self-aggrandizing, and instead comes across as a well-crafted wake-up call. The Boards of Canada remix I ended up hearing before I heard the original version, given that a friend sent it to me, partly in order to try and get me to cover more Boards of Canada on this channel, so thank you very much. You know who you are. That said, since listening to the original version, I have to say that this remix has shrunk on me somewhat. It keeps some of the stoner rock elements of the original, not necessarily directly intact, but certainly fragments of them. You get these stabs of what sounds like the original bass, but much more overcranked.
With wet coke in a Starbucks bathroom with the door closed on booze. I'm left in residue and confused, like the first time you use soft water.
This track works well at first. The chorus is starker and feels a little bit uglier, like it's been harmonized somewhat heavier.
Sinking and laughing at something sunken in, I am. If I'm sinking and laughing at something sunken in, I am.
Over the second verse, however, this big soaring drone comes in.
Lead late in a bad way on Broadway, sending sexy SMSs to my ex's new man, cause I can, on the road trying to break an old band, eating pussy.
The drone kind of drowns out a fair amount of Yoni's vocals, and it's at this weird pitch where it becomes pretty grating, especially given how long that they ride it out for in this remix. It pretty much goes on until the end. There's just not enough up and down dynamics to it. It just kind of goes up and kind of gets on my nerves after a while. I think the original really nailed the accompaniment as far as the vocals go, and here I feel like Boards of Canada are laying it on a little bit thick. There's this coda at the end where they take the beat out and replace it with some congas, which go at a very different, much faster tempo. It's a nice idea, and again seems like something that could have been inspired from older rock music, like maybe Love You Too by the Beatles or Baba O'Reilly by The Who. But again, it's an element that I feel would have worked better if they mixed things up a bit more melodically and got rid of that drone, which just really hampers the track for me. I'm a little torn on this one because despite all that, I do think there's a lot to like about this remix. I like the way the rock elements are distributed across the track, and I think had the drone been used more sparingly, I'd feel warmer towards this track. As it stands, it's a high C or a low B for me, and I think I'm going to go with bottom of the B tier here. It's one of the only remixes alongside Sisters that I feel is a downgrade from the original, but at the same time it at least tries to do something different with the track, and I feel like I respect it for that, even if it doesn't really work quite so well for me. So that is my tier list of Boards of Canada's official remixes. A particularly strong set of reworks over the years, I must say. It's the first tier list I've done where nothing belongs lower than the C tier for me, although if I do have a complaint about their remix oeuvre, I do wish they hadn't been quite so cliquey about who they chose to remix over the years. Seems like half of their remixes were for Warp Records affiliates and the other half were for members of cLOUDDEAD, and I kind of wish they'd branched out a little more in terms of who they'd chosen to work with, just to see what would have happened. Having said that though, this level of quality control is probably what enabled them to make the music they did over the years, so I can't begrudge them for keeping their trust confined to a limited selection of collaborators. The main thing I've gleaned from this list though is I definitely feel like Boards of Canada hit on something more special when they work with actual songs, as the top 4 remixes in my list show that they can craft some real magic when they're given a full set of lyrics to work with. Anyways, thank you very much for watching this video. Please do let me know in the comments section what you thought about these rankings. Do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? Are there any other remixes you'd like to see me do a tier list of? If so, please let me know below, and please do subscribe to the channel if you want to see more remix based content. Thank you very much for watching. This video is over.